That's pretty cool. Yeah.
Hello everyone, I'm Megan and this is Michelle, and we'd like to welcome you to our first ever for this year speaker series. Cole is our first speaker, Cole Atlin. She's a resident of St. Mary's and she's our library chair, head. So Cole is here to talk about mining and everything we don't know about what you do.
Yeah.
So welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming and being
Thank
here
you.
first. And stay after, visit, have some goodies, some coffee. And we are continuing our speaker series throughout the summer. Our next speaker is June 27th. It's the last Tuesday of every month, and it's Charles Sharon. So welcome, Nicole.
Thank you, Megan. And thank you everybody for coming. I know the vast majority of this audience, so that adds a little extra something, maybe nerves or fear, but I don't know. No, I'm kidding. But maybe not a little bit. But I present probably once or twice a month to different crowds, to mining execs or First Nations people or government folks or whomever it is, but this is my first time giving a public lecture, so I'm very excited to be here doing this today. And I'm also really thankful for the efforts that the staff has put together to put this on, and I'm happy to be the guinea pig for the first one of these. So as chair, you know, it's great to be here. I hear about all the great programming they do, so it's great to finally be sort of part of one. So you may not be able to see the title, but it says Seeing Beyond Today, Next Generation Assessment in Canada's Mid-North. So my work, if you change the slide, there you go. My mentor always says to start with a cartoon because this one's a bit dark, but at the same point in time, it's important to sort of frame the context of my work. So a lot of people, when they think about environmentalism, they focus on sort of, there's a lot of individualism and sort of internationalism. So with individualism, it's the things we do every day, but maybe buy organics, take transit, try and buy local, those sort of things. And those have market effects and those sort of things like that. Then there's the international side, climate change negotiations, anti-whaling, all of those things that take place at a larger scale international level. And my work sort of takes place in between. And what I particularly focus on is mining developments in northern Canada and the infrastructure and developments that surround those, making those choices and how we do that. If you can hit the next slide for me. This map, which I did not create, you'll get to see my map making skills in a bit. And I'll tell you something else. But this is sort of what we call the mid-north of Canada. So my primary research cases that I'm going to be talking about, research cases and the cases I work on, because I'm also, along with being a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo, I'm also a consultant, and I work in these developments. One of them is here called the Ring of Fire, and also you should probably know about the oil sands development, tar sands, however you want to phrase it, up here in northern Alberta. I'll also be talking a little bit about a few other cases, but as you can see, sort of this belt here is where you've seen a lot of industrial development in Canada over the last 25 years. But one of the other important parts of this is that you don't have much of a population. So a lot of the developments that happen here are massive in size and scope and impact, but you have most of our population lives here and along here. So you have fewer people impacted parties, except a lot of First Nations communities and Indigenous communities. And these developments happen at a much larger scale in things that wouldn't be able to necessarily fly in the south. So I'm gonna get sort of into discussing environmental assessment because that's what I primarily focus on, but there are lots of different instruments that we use to make environmental decisions. But my focus is on something called environmental assessment. An environmental assessment, I wrote a little definition for you guys, is environmental assessment attempts to anticipate potential negative environmental impacts of an undertaking and devise ways of mitigating them. It's sort of like a stitch in time saves 9 concept. Came out of pollution abatement legislation from the 1970s. And so when any of these, we have environmental assessments for lots of things. The Green Bridge had an environmental assessment. We have tons of environmental assessments across Canada. Provinces, territories, and the feds all have environmental assessment legislative processes. But mines and big industrial developments and things like that, like big roads, dams, all those things, have much bigger environmental assessments. And because those developments create a lot of controversy and have huge impacts to the way not only the landscape is, but the socioeconomics of a region. Like, they'll change it fundamentally forever. Though the environmental assessments tend to have a lot of conflict, and they have a lot of scrutiny, particularly afterwards. So this is what my area of research focuses on. So if you can flip to the next slide, I'm getting a taste of the lovely graphics I've used here. But this is how, currently we use environmental assessment, we use something called project-based environmental assessment. And so what a project is like one mine, or one dam, a road, one individual thing. And you may think that's a big deal to assess the potential negative impacts and try to, what we call, mitigate them. And it is, but it only has a certain scope. So what we do in an environmental assessment at a project level is undertaken by what we call a proponent, or the person who's proposing to do the work. So if you're a mining company, will do the environmental assessment in order to prove that none of these things, that they're not going to have significant adverse effect to the environment. So they'll look at things like local and at-risk endangered species, best available technologies as alternatives of what we could do. One of the big things with mines is creating bonds for cleanup for legacies. That's something that they may have to discuss. It may not be in the assessment process, but it's often linked to it. Pollution and permitting. So this is the amount you're allowed to pollute. We do that a lot with effluents in the water and also air pollution. What monitoring you're going to do to make sure you hit those levels. That comes up in the environmental assessment often. And no-go alternatives. So what happens if you don't go forward? And generally this is phrased as, with a no-go alternative, you lose all economic opportunities and everyone has negative ramifications and all those things. You either generally have the project at its full scale or totally a no-go. You don't have generally an in-between, which is sort of our ongoing theme of what I'm going to talk about, the in-between. So let's look at what happens often in my made-up world that I'm going to show you, in Canadian island, of when you have a project-level environmental assessment. So if you can go to the next slide. This is my community. This is this lovely island. Islands are easier for bounding, so that's why, and I could find the image on the internet today. So this is let's say this is a traditional small island in Canada. You have an indigenous community, small dock, dirt road. Only way in and out of the island is a dock. You've got endangered species on multiple parts of the island. They may go through the center. This might be a way you have, that might be the range of the species. Sacred indigenous sites, coastal fisheries. It's sort of that idealized concept that we have this perfect environment and we need to maintain it. That's sort of this image. But there's other elements that we need to talk about environmental assessment and making these decisions. And that, so this is an indigenous community in an isolated and remote place. They're very likely poor, extremely poor. They may not have access to clean, reliable water. They may not have access to schools, and so a lot of the communities I work with, once they get to grade 8, they have to move to go to school. You have a lot of people who want to have opportunities would leave this community to find opportunities on a more populated area. And in some ways it's a challenging life. You would have import food as well as rely on traditional hunting and gathering. So there are, really positive aspects of this community that you'd want to maintain, cultural, spiritual significance, things like that, but also economic opportunities that just don't exist nowadays. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is they found ore. They were staking and they found ore. So each of these red boxes represents an project level environmental assessment. So if you find ore, let's say, and if you go back to actually 2 slides, let's say with this, one more. So each of those different mines would have to go through all of these elements, right? They'd have to show that they're not putting local at risk or local at risk species in any danger, that they're not having significant adverse effects, that those things are being met, those stipulations. And that they're using best available technologies, or they have capacity to change those things and all that stuff. But if you have multiple companies who have all found ore, and you have the government that's maybe putting in infrastructure to support these mines or whatever the industrial process might be, you can have multiple sites come online at once or within very short succession. And because you're only looking at, it's almost what is almost considered a sort of, if you're looking at legally, like the private property understanding of the land, it's just that where the proponent has been demarcated their space, what we call cumulative effects are not considered very easily. So if you go back, 2 more slides. Thank you, remote.
AI.
I'm doing a great job. You could have 5 mines all receive approval at the same time. In order to support that, you could have a large road that's developed as well as small roads. That would require an environmental assessment as well. And then, so there are obviously ecological consequences with that. You would have habitat fragmentation, rangeland would be changed. You would have obviously effluents that might go into water systems. And you also would have air pollution. And because when you have concentrated a lot of facilities at one spot, you can actually have climate change happen more locally at a faster rate. So things will heat up more directly right in that one spot. Additionally, to support these levels of development, you'll probably need more people. You need people to be able to at least fly in and out to work. So you'll likely have a mine, you'll likely have an airport, you might have to expand the dock, those would require environmental assessment, and your community would expand as well. There are challenges with boom and bust communities, which is what we refer to as the communities that surround mining development. Because they emerge often so rapidly, you have a lot of people come and you don't have the social services necessarily to support them. You have higher rates of crime, particularly violent crime, abuse against women. You have a lot of fewer people who feel connected or invested into communities, and you have a lot more challenges that relate specifically to that. Additionally, you have the bust option. So let's say, as we're going along, and minerals are very volatile. They're extremely volatile as an industry. That these 3 mines are owned by maybe one proponent, and they are having financial difficulties. And even though they have not exhausted the ore, there's tons of ore still there, they may close up shop because it's just so expensive to get the ore into that boat out. And they may go bankrupt. Let's say they go bankrupt. Now you might think, oh, that's not a very high possibility. It is. It's very frequent that you have a mining company that'll go bankrupt midway through operation or towards the tail end of operation. So what happens is they maybe have not contributed all of the bond for cleanup, or they just don't have the money to make the cleanup. So that falls onto the government. Right now, BC has this year $1.27 billion in legacies on that to clean up. That's just BC. It's what we call orphaned and abandoned mines. There actually is now a registry in Canada if you want to look it up. But that leaves in that sacred indigenous site, as well as along this waterway, a huge amount of it's improperly decommissioned mine just sitting there. You have tailings that can go into the water system, which have, let's just say, gross stuff in them, as well as a lot of infrastructure. You have to have probably diesel power generation and roads and things like that that are just existing that are not going anywhere. And that also puts a huge pressure on communities when you lose a major employer. So this is less than an ideal situation, but all the stories I've just talked about actually happen pretty frequently in Canada. And this is what we want to try and avoid with our assessment and planning policy, which is kind of what I'm going to next. Slide. Okay, so I want to give you a real life example of this cumulative effect stuff. So this is in northern BC, northeastern BC. I'm sure you can all clearly read this map because it's so easy to read, but in here this is Hudson's Hope, which you may not know, and then in here is Fort St. John. This is the sort of oil and gas boom that's happening in northern British Columbia right now. All the black and gray dots on this map are oil and gas wells. On this side is oil and gas wells along with roadways, seismic lines, transmission lines, pipeline tenures, consolidated cutbacks, and agricultural areas with a 250-meter buffer. Why that 250-meter buffer is important is because if you say have a pipeline, you can't just put agricultural area lands or plant and hunt in that area. It is the 250 meters on either side is sort of a no-go. So that is what the land looks like now for the Blueberry River First Nations, who have treaty rights to hunt, fish, and trap in that region. Why this is really problematic for them is that the cumulative effects of this development have all of this development have reduced the amount of available fish, bison, moose, all of these things, as well as contaminated a lot of areas where there would be traditional gathering for medicinal plants, things like that. So right now there's a major case going on with the Blueberry River First Nations against the province, saying that the cumulative effect impacts of all of this oil and gas development have prevented them from utilizing their treaty rights. And so this is a major, so what I was showing you in that previous slide may have seemed like sort of this imaginary land that I made up, which I did. It's actually happening on the ground, and it's changing Canadian legislation right now. And so this is going to be something to see that we're watching, that a lot of us are watching to see what happens in this case, because as it goes up further into the Supreme Court, what's going to happen. Next slide, if you would not mind. So what do you do? If project level assessment is so challenging to actually identify these cumulative effects, what do you do to actually integrate these into our policy? And so what I'm going to talk about, there's lots of ways you can do it, but I'm going to talk about one specifically today, which is called strategic environmental assessment. So strategic environmental assessment looks at the overall large term of development